concise history of the First Crusade. This video podcast is a collaboration between Flashpoint History and the Ancient History Guy, two excellent sources dedicated to making history accessible, interesting, and perhaps a little snarky. In the latter part of the 11th century, the medieval world would witness one of the most destructive time periods in history, and coming from a medieval perspective, that's saying quite a bit. An armed pilgrimage was sent to liberate Jerusalem and the Levant. It would be known to later historians as the First Crusade. Now, the interesting part about the First Crusade is that no one seems to be able to give a definitive reason for what caused it. If you ask 5 different historians, well, you're going to get 5 different answers. Some say it had to do with the Islamic conquest of the early 7th century, which was a pretty impressive expansion. This land grab managed to take Arabia, Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levant, Persia, and many others. In fact, in 100 years, the lands that were controlled by Islam would go from being essentially a city-state to having one border on the Atlantic Ocean and the other in India. Now, others stress that the First Crusade was caused by a need to recapture Jerusalem, and still others say it had to do with the invasion of the Seljuk Turks, who pushed back the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine. Eventually, this prompted the Byzantine emperor to ask for help, which in turn, this plea for help landed on the desk of, how do we say this nicely, one of the more aggressive and politically enterprising popes, who would go on to milk it for whatever it was worth. But ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a concise history of the First Crusade, and we will not dilly-dally long with why it actually happened, but rather we're going to cover the main events. But don't let me hold you back from commenting on why you think this all came down. Go nuts, people. I am looking forward to the responses. So with that, our story begins in the year 1071. The Eastern Roman Empire, again the Byzantine, had seen better days. The empire had been attacked by nearly all of her neighbors on nearly all of her borders and was now a fragment of her former glory. Like an accordion that expands and contracts, she had taken a massive beatdown and was now trying to expand once again. Thus, it was in this year, 1071, that the Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes, who was born into a military family, decided to take a massive, though somewhat undisciplined army out to regain lost territory. He was fighting against a relatively new threat known as the Seljuk Turks. These were a group of Asiatic warriors who had come in from east of the Caspian Sea and who had adopted Sunni Islam along the way. By the 1040s, they had secured a vast tract of land and in the process had displaced not only the Byzantine Empire but also the Fatimid Caliphate. Romanus IV was initially successful in his military expedition, but like with many medieval campaigns, everything goes great until it doesn't. It was in the extreme eastern portion of Asia Minor that his forces met up with a Seljuk army under the command of their leader, Alp Arslan, and near the city of Manzikert, Romanus IV and his army were soundly defeated. To be clear, Romanus survived, but his army didn't. This would set off a power struggle within the Byzantine Empire that would soon be engulfed in internecine conflict and civil war. But to be honest, we are talking about the Byzantine political system here, and this wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. However, the Seljuk noted a weakened rival and they pressed the offensive. They managed to push the borders of the Byzantine Empire back nearly to the gates of Constantinople. After approximately 20 years of infighting, a new emperor came to the throne, named Alexius I Comnenus. He managed to better unify the Byzantine court and then sought to expand the empire once again. The only problem was that most of Asia Minor was now under new management, and Asia Minor was, after all, the heartland of the empire and a source of wealth, food, and manpower for the army. Alexius I came to the conclusion that he would need some help, and since most of his immediate neighbors were rather belligerent, he realized that he'd have to ask from a more distant source. This wasn't going to be an easy decision, as it would mean swallowing a bit of pride, if not a bit of vomit. Let's go back for a second. Christianity had at this point in history split into two major factions. Actually more than that, but we're just going to focus on the two. In the east, you had the Greek Orthodox Church based in Constantinople, and in the west, you had the conveniently named Roman Catholic Church, which was centered in, well, Rome. Kinda sorta. The two had split in the year 1054 in what was known as the Great Schism. Well, in reality, it was several years in the making and several years in the implementation, but if you're ever asked this on a test, or in the insanely unlikely chance that this ever comes up at a party, you place your hands on your hips, stare down the person who asked you with an icy gaze, and say, "It happened in 1054, and make sure you say it with a cool, confident voice. So, for Alexius I to ask for help from the Roman Catholic Church was kind of like asking your ex for a helping hand to move. For all intents and purposes, all the Byzantine emperor was really hoping for was for a few thousand mercenaries to help him take on the Seljuk Turks. And to be clear, this wasn't the first time the emperor had asked for help. But the Pope, who got his message, had a completely different idea. The Pope at the time was Urban II, who was dealing with his own issues. His grasp on papal authority was tenuous. I mean, the man wasn't even able to enter Rome. He and the King of Germany, who would later be referred to as the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, had a major disagreement on who the actual Pope really was. It was awkward to say the least. If Henry had had it his way, there would have been another man named Clement III in the pointy hat. So Urban II was always looking for an angle at self-promotion. In March of 1095, at the Council of Piacenza, he got the Byzantine call for assistance. He thought it over for a little bit, and sure, he could send over a few thousand mercenaries to assist the Eastern Church, or he could go for the gusto. So a few months later, in November of 1095, Urban II gave a speech in the city of Clermont that would fundamentally change the Christian world. And by the way, just as a side note, the picture that everybody posts when they talk about this event where the Pope is inside the Cathedral of Clermont talking to a host of people, it is completely false. The speech happened outside as the cathedral wasn't yet completed and there was just too many people. Remember to point this fact out if ever asked at a party as well. People will either respect you for it or think you're some sort of giant history dork. In either case, Urban wanted to take this to an all-new level and kill several birds with one stone. He proposed that the lords of Europe, who were busy killing one another, should rather instead combine their aggressive streaks and focus on killing the Saracen. Urban had figured out that having a common enemy is great when it comes to starting a conflict. He also proposed that they should go forth and liberate the Levant, and especially focus on freeing the, quote, imperiled Jerusalem, where their fellow Christians were being persecuted and slaughtered by the Muslims. Truly tragic stuff. The only hitch in his statement was that Jerusalem was taken in 637. That's right, over 450 years prior to his speech. That's just shy of half a millennia. That is, the city had been under Muslim management for a really long time. What's more, there was little evidence that the Christians and the Jews were undergoing any type of atrocity whatsoever. In fact, pilgrimages to the Holy City continued as it was simply lucrative for the locals, and the administration knew that you don't mess with a good thing. Then there was always that faint notion in Urban's head that by sending over troops, the Eastern Church would be grateful and somehow reunite with the West. But I think putting toothpaste back in the tube would likely have been easier. The speech got an immediate response because Urban's pilgrimage also included his greatest selling point, redemption. Up until this point, from a Christian perspective, it was sinful to kill. But now to kill an infidel in the cause of liberating the Holy Land was the path to heaven. This was dynamite stuff. Urban was alluding to the idea that the people of Christendom should go on an armed pilgrimage, have a few laughs, kill a few heathens, and liberate the center of Christianity. And the reward would be golden. Golden halo, that is. Okay, so no one knows precisely what the Pope actually said, but according to one chronicler, a Robert the Monk, Urban said the following, quote, "This land which you inhabit, shut in on all sides by the seas and surrounded by the mountain peaks, is too narrow for your large population. Hence it is you that murder one another, that you wage war, and that frequently you perish by mutual wounds. Let therefore hatred depart from among you. Let your quarrels end, let wars cease, and let all dissensions and controversies slumber. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Wrest that land from the wicked race, and subject it to yourselves. God has conferred upon you above all nations great glory in arms. Accordingly, undertake this journey for the remission of your sins with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven." End quote. The man was a marketing genius. He looked up after giving his speech to his audience and said, "Deus vult," and the people went for this in droves. The lords and princes at the Council of Clermont began to recite, "Deus vult, Deus vult, God wills it, God wills it." As the chanting grew in intensity, a one Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy came forth and proclaimed his devotion and asked the Pope if he could be the spiritual head of the movement, and this was granted. The First Crusade was on. Of course, it wasn't actually called a crusade, it was simply a pilgrimage with a lot of weaponry, but it was on. Pope Urban set the departure date to August of the next year, 1096. He figured that the princes of Europe would need time to raise funds, assemble troops, and arrange logistics. But for some people, and there's always this type in every crowd, they simply didn't want to wait this long, and so they set off right away. The appeal of getting into heaven by going on pilgrimage was just too alluring for many. Many of the rank and file, the low-level nobility, or the common soldier decided that they were going to take Urban II up on his offer and began to move almost immediately. There were some in France that decided to follow a man named Walter Saint-Avoir. This group made it into portions of Hungary before they began to rampage, pillage, burn, and slaughter. They were eventually rebuked by the Byzantine for their brashness, but many still made it to Constantinople. There were others in the Rhineland who decided to follow a Count Amico of Leiningen, but along the way they decided that since they were out to fight the enemies of their faith, this would include the Jews along the path. Thus, the cities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, to name a few, would see the grotesque massacre of the local Jewish population. And this, despite the heroic efforts of the local Christians to defend them. This group also proceeded to rampage, pillage, burn, and slaughter. Now, the superstar of what was going to be known as the People's Crusade was a man named Peter the Hermit. Around the city of Cologne, he rallied an estimated 40,000 people, many selling everything they owned to join him. This group also made it to Hungary, where the wary locals asked Peter to keep his people in line and swear that his movement would be peaceful. He agreed, and his followers remained peaceful until halfway into Hungary, at which point a disagreement over a pair of shoes culminated in, yes, you guessed it, rampaging, pillaging, burning, and slaughtering. This would continue again and again. In fact, when they got to the city of Belgrade, it too was not spared by the frenzy and was burned to the ground. Anybody out there picking up on the motif here? Oh, and by the way, just as a side note, not every group decided to follow a human. There was a report that a group of pilgrims had decided to follow a goose. That's right, a bird, that they felt was inspired by divinity. So, keep that in mind if you ever feel so inclined to sell everything you own and march thousands of miles on foot, mind you, to liberate another country by following an avian creature or some sort of other fowl. Know that in history, it's already been done. In August of 1096, this giant, unruly mob arrived at Constantinople. Alexius I decided to quickly ferry them across the Bosphorus, effectively making his problem somebody else's problem. They were now essentially in enemy territory, a true test of the pilgrim, and perhaps with this recognition one would adopt a more spiritual and enlightened disposition. But instead, they opted to go back to the tried and true method of rampaging, pillaging, burning, and slaughtering that they had gotten so good at. This bad behavior would only be tolerated for so long. The Sultanate of Rm, which was the name that the Seljuk gave to Anatolia, was ruled by Kilij Arslan. This was a man who was not to be trifled with. When he got word of the belligerent multitude, he sent in his army. The undisciplined rowdy mob was now faced with a professional force. You know, one that could actually fight back. They didn't stand a chance. In October, the People's Crusade was surrounded and wiped out almost entirely. Only a few managed to escape back to Constantinople to recount the horrendous tale. Peter the Hermit at this time was in the city being wined and dined by the Byzantine court. He didn't really know what to say to these people. But those that made it back were able to see the professional crusading army that had just recently arrived.